Okay, so we're going to talk about evaluating complex programs. This is what I want to talk about. What's the problem? What are we talking about? I want to say just a couple of things about complexity, just so we kind of understand what we mean when we talk about complexity. I want to talk about transitions, these ideas of big shifts in socio-technical systems, which in a way are at one end of the spectrum of complexity of programs that we need to think about. I want to offer you some evaluation perspectives and think a bit about where do we go from here. Do I have the answer in perfect terms how to evaluate large and complex programs? No. So if you expect that, I won't be offended if you leave now. Meanwhile, I think we probably can say some amusing things about it. So the problem. Why are we interested in how to evaluate complex programs? Well, one of the things we're seeing is a resurgence of high-level national strategies for industry, for enabling technologies and innovation. So there's an interest in doing bigger things at national scale. We're having to engage with the societal challenges, which are cross-sectoral and interdisciplinary in nature. They're large-scale. They require wide societal engagement. Again, very different from the kind of research and innovation policies we've driven in the past. These things tend to involve multiple agencies, ministries, other actors. We probably need to think more about common evaluation frameworks and strategies. They also tend to be dynamic and to involve learning. So governance itself starts becoming more complex, and we're going to have to think, I think, a bit more explicitly about the governance of innovation. So how do we get here? Well, you're familiar with the old linear models of innovation. This is the 1950s version, Vannevar Bush. The idea is if you just pour lots of money on the basic researchers, then somehow everybody will get wealthy and happy. The 60s version that says, hey, innovation is a linear process, but it's actually that needs that suck knowledge out of the science system. And for the last 30 years or so, we've tended to draw these kinds of innovation models where everything's kind of connected to everything else, and you get feedback loops and backs and forwards, and you can never really say where innovation starts. That leads us in the end to think in terms of innovation systems. And this is a structural view. You can take a functional view as well if you like. But where we're basically saying in order to do research and innovation policy, we really need to think about pretty much the whole system. Yeah? The industrial system, where the money and the jobs get made, the education and research system, the intermediaries, the infrastructure, including things like banking, patenting, framework conditions, demand, massively important and increasingly reflected in some of our innovation policies, and not least the political system. Yeah, the policy, governance, and how that acts on all that stuff. So if we think about how that evolution of ideas interacts with how policymakers act, we see in the 50s and 60s science push innovation policies, which largely mean giving money to basic research. Running a few big mission projects, but largely basic research. And we see these things then expanding into much bigger technology push projects, grands projets, as one says in French. Yeah? And some of those have been very successful, like French atomic power and more recently Airbus. They often rely on development pairs, where the state pushes the technology and the state is at least the initial buyer of the technology, so it's a well-controlled situation. And these things, you will know, become complete disasters if you get so arrogant that you ignore the characteristics of demand or imagine that somehow you're more important than market forces. So we got glorious failures like the very beautiful Concorde supersonic aircraft. Just don't stand underneath it because it's noisy and smelly. Where the designers essentially extrapolated the speed of the aircraft as the variable to improve, while Boeing, of course, went away and extrapolated the cost per seat mile and built the 747. Okay, so we made a rich people's toy, which was absolutely useless. cost us billions. The Plan d'Action pour la filière électronique used money from privatizing part of France Telecom in an effort to turn Honeywell Bull into a world champion mainframe computer maker, just at the point where we were at the end of the life cycle of mainframe computers. Mini computers were popping up, and at the point where IBM controlled 94% of the mainframe computer market and had the same turnover as Greece. If that isn't arrogance, I don't know what is arrogance. Okay. Anyway, moving on. Through the 70s in the research side, we increasingly understand the importance of the coupling between supply and demand. The centrality of producer users in innovation. Landmark studies like Sappho at Sprue. Interesting contributions here, among others from Leonard Ehle in the 70s, von Hippel, Murray and Rosenberg. And these things start pushing us towards the more systemic concept. In the 80s, we see an interesting period of national technology programs, lots of them in information technology, which sort of misunderstand the Japanese model. What the Brits did, Alvi, Esprit, Alvi, Esprit is actually a copy of Alvi. IT4 is another version of that here, from Swedish policy in the 1980s, was basically national champion promotion. Copying Japanese programs which didn't pick winners, but promoted ecosystems. Promoted systems of potential winners and then let them fight it out, much more powerful. And where we end up with all this is a huge aversion to picking winners. I think a policy judgment that says it's important to work with ecosystems, with clusters, but not to be so prescriptive that you kind of rule out the potential winners from the game. And that gets us into more and more complex interventions. In the good old bad old days, if you like, if you think about the number of measures you would take at one time and the number of actors involved, we would tend to sit down here. Give a professor money to do a project. Give a firm a subsidy to make it, to introduce a product. And gradually, whichever way we go, we end up with multi-actor, multi-measure systems. Things like competence centers, for example. We have many actors involved. We do many things at once. We have many objectives all at the same time. And these are very amusing and absolute hell to evaluate. What we then see is, if you like, 3 generations of innovation system governance. And these things are kind of sedimentary layers. It's not that we do one thing at one point and then we throw it away and then we do something else. These things live on. So the post-World War II blind delegation to the scientific community based on the linear model, essentially disconnecting research from innovation, is alive and well at living at Vetenskapsrådet. Okay? We still use that model and it still has value, but it's no longer the only thing we do. From the 1960s, we see the idea of science policy popping up, and eventually the innovation systems concept. Innovation policy becomes industry policy becomes innovation policy. And we start getting a much more holistic approach with growing focus on coordination across ministries and sectors and on institutional performance. Now we move to this era of societal challenges, some of whose resolution requires degrees of transition between socio-technical systems. The classic one that everybody talks about is how do we change the way the electricity generation, supply and delivery system actually works. All our windmills and our photocells and feed-in tariffs and regulation, and when you start looking at that, you see how bloody complicated it is. It's not just, let's give a professor some money to do something clever and something good will happen, like it happened in the 1950s. Right? So that's the degree of complexity that we need to work with. And as we go through these 3 generations, in a sense, we're developing different rationales for the state to intervene. In the good old bad old days, we talked about market failure. That's the one that even neoclassical economists accept, where we basically say it's not attractive for companies, private companies, to do research because projects are often indivisible. You can't appropriate and monopolize the knowledge. It escapes, it spills over, and there's a lot of uncertainty, which is why the state needs to go in and take the risks on behalf of society. Then, as we move towards innovation systems, we start talking about systems failure, things like capability failures, institutional failures, network failures, framework failures. And as we move towards transitions, we get another set of failures. Directionality, we need to change the direction of a technological trajectory. We need to get demand to be articulated or re-articulated. We need to coordinate policy. We need to be reflexive and change our mind about what we're doing during the course of doing things. So the governance thing goes along in a sense with a change in the kind of stories we tell ourselves. This is sort of my icon for trying to think about how, at least in the second generation, in the innovation systems world, how do we think about governing research and innovation systems? And this is just the classical structure of government. And the problem is, with all these different ministers and different levels, how do you coordinate the actors to have a holistic research and innovation policy? And we coordinate at the level of ministers. Sometimes we have policy councils, sometimes they're effectives, sometimes they're coffee clubs, no comment. Sometimes we try and coordinate at the level of agencies. Sometimes the really good coordination is happening down here at the level of the researchers. We saw some wonderful examples in Finland some years ago of what we called supernodes, professors who knew how to take money off everybody. They did the coordination. So it happens in all sorts of ways, and it tends to be very disorganized and not terribly effective. We've never really cracked the coordination problem, and that coordination problem then gets worse as we move towards transitions. Right? You live with this, you know this better than me. Okay, so that's kind of where we start. What about this complexity thing? Well, just one slide. I'm fascinated every few years by complexity, and so is every other social scientist I think I've ever met. We don't do it all the time. The idea's got roots in the early history of computing, Norbert Wiener, von Bertalanffy a bit later on. Really worth reading, Lars Ingerstam's book. You can read it. Which reflects on the coming and going of complexity and how that relates to energy systems. Really, really good stuff. And this issue repeatedly pops up as an issue in policy and social science, but it doesn't really seem to have made much of a difference. It popped up in New Tech and the early part of Innova in the complex technical systems program, which ran for 6 years, I think, and tried to do all sorts of experiments in understanding complexity in engineering, and then somehow never managed to integrate them into the sort of theoretical basis that you would need to drive engineering through understanding complexity. And we kind of do the same in social science. We talk about it, we don't deeply understand it. When I talk about complexity, and I will try and be consistent, I do not mean the same thing as complicated. Complicated is there's many bits to it, and it can be quite difficult to understand because there's stuff all over the place. But fundamentally, it's a system you can describe, and having described it once, it doesn't change. You don't have to re-describe it. Complexity has got some characteristics which make it different. There are feedback loops in a complex situation. Think of an innovation system. There are feedback loops that change the characteristics of the system. Very often you can't describe the way the system functions at a very high level. You have to describe it both at a high level and at a lower level. So these things have emergent properties. there are properties that pop up which you couldn't necessarily have predicted at the outset. And when we come to think about how do you make a theory or a design for an intervention that you can rely on and work with, how do you do that if the system you're playing with actually has emergent properties? The thing changes as you touch it. Huge fun. Right. Let's talk a bit about transitions. This is the sticky end. And most of the people who write about transitions tend to work with a three-level, multi-level framework, MLF. Well, in my day, MLF was the multilateral force, but that was 1960s. Okay, so, and it's kind of handy for thinking about what do you sort of mean. They talk about socio-technical regimes, or technological innovation systems, if you like. Like fossil fuel-driven road vehicles. Yeah? It's a whole system, tradition, years of engineering, millions of years of people's effort, locking us in to a particular way of doing things, investment in infrastructure, the way the roads work, or the way the railways work. Yeah? And we live for very long periods inside individual social technical regimes. You know? And the issue with transitions is sometimes you need to make quite big shifts in that. So we talk about niche innovations, sometimes flowing up and affecting technological regimes. The social technical regimes can have an effect on the overall landscape. Often it's desired that it have. For example, changing the way the road transport works has an effect at the level of climate change, we hope. Yeah? So we tend to think at these kind of three levels. And I've been reading an awful lot of this stuff lately, for some reason. One of the things that strikes you is how repetitive it is. Everybody's kind of saying the same thing, but you know, I suppose that's one of the nasty features of this pressure that we're all under to publish, you know, even if what we have to say is trivial. We just have to pump the papers out, all right? There's a kind of good summary, I think, of the thinking by Frank Geels, report for OECD 3 years ago, and he is pretty much one of the leading thinkers in the area. So he's talking here, well, what are the barriers to transitions? Yeah? So these are kind of problems that we need to deal with when we put together the programs. Yeah? So over-reliance on market failure rationales. You know, we have old-fashioned mental models of how things work. Short-term political processes. Again, you work with governments. You know the trade-offs between the political cycle and the reality that things take time in research and innovation, right? Fragmented, multi-layered institutions, governance structures and processes. So we got this disorganization problem. Technological trajectories and lock-ins. Market power and the clout, in political terms, of incumbents. Yeah? Not to be underestimated. Yeah? So much of this is not technical. So much of this is power relations and social stuff and politics. Lack of customer acceptance and adoption of new things, institutional inertia and path dependency. A couple of things he doesn't mention, which I think are important. Very often, the absolute costs of systemic change are ridiculously big. Yeah? And it takes a long time before you get return on investment. And again, that's going to be a serious disincentive for private capital in some cases. And we've got massive uncertainties and risks associated with the disruptive innovations that you need. And one of the things that one will want to do in programs which tackle transitions is actually to deal with the risks. Start road mapping, for example, so we get a consensus about which way things go. And I think reality really is, in a sense, quite malleable. You know? You can get an awfully long way if everybody agrees we're going to go that way rather than that way. Often it doesn't really matter which way you go, you just have to make your bloody mind up. Yeah? So what are the policy implications of that? And again, I'm relying on Frank here. Understand the systemic nature of the problem, the role and feasibility of architectural change. You need a clear focus from political and administrative levels. You need to create shared visions, consensus among stakeholders. You need to figure out how to manage and overcome often deliberate resistance, including by building social capital behind the transition. And of course, people with vested interests will fight back. Coal, North America, I mean, you know, we have lots of silly and obvious examples. We need to get much more creative in administration, you know, develop change agency and coordination capacities in the administration. Yeah. Probably collect more strategic intelligence, data, and do more analysis. Not least, we probably have to think more about systems analysis, which we haven't done. Yeah. Again, it's one of those curious things when you look at the long history of ideas in research and innovation policy. In the late 60s and early 70s, when science policy was being born, systems analysis and operations research was very closely tied into it. So the biggest organization in the game, the Fraunhofer Institute for Innovation and Systems Analysis, Fraunhofer ISI in Karlsruhe, reflects in its title this integration with the idea of systems. And we've kind of lost it. Yeah, we don't do this very much. I guess the energy freaks still do it a bit. Sweden used to be world leading in systems analysis around energy. But we don't seem to have many of these skills now, and that's something I fear we're going to have to deal with. Then we need to develop a transition strategy, and that could be a number of things, but it may mean radical stuff like challenging a dominant design and putting in place the system elements that you need to support new ones. So some of the dimensions we need to tackle in transitions are technology, user practices, the symbolic meaning of technology. Again, hearts and minds. It's not just hard stuff. Infrastructure, industry structure, policy, the whole field of knowledge, techno-scientific knowledge around the subject. So just to take a more or less random example from the literature, we're talking about the socio-technical configuration in personal transportation. What kind of things do we have to deal with? The cultural symbolic meanings, you know, the power of owning a car, the freedom, all the symbols that come with that. You know, vroom vroom, go faster stripes, noises. Finance rules, interest rates, insurance premiums, yeah? Regulations and policies like where are you allowed to park, yeah? Environmental standards, the road infrastructure, industry structure, you know? Car manufacturers, do they change? Maintenance and distribution networks. How in God's name are we going to charge all those electric cars? Yeah? Markets and user practices. Yeah? How do people understand vehicle use in a different way? Yeah? The vehicle itself with all its subsystems. Yeah? And this is a simple example. Right? So how do we get our arms around all this stuff? Well, some of the ways I think are to do with focusing more on functions, which we don't normally think about in innovation policy. I mean, Edqvist, Bergek, and various others on the other side of the country, or the other sides, have been thinking quite a lot about functions in innovation systems, with more or less good results. Taken up by Heckert in the Netherlands. And these seem to be at least some, I'm sure it's not a complete list, of the functions that we need to invoke. So entrepreneurial activities, knowledge development and diffusion through networks, sometimes guiding the search. Let's agree to look in this direction, not look in that direction. Yeah? Market formation, You know? Unless you get markets, in the end, you can't get innovations to spread. Resource mobilization, both financial and human capital is a lot slower to raise than money, and not least creation of legitimacy and counteracting resistance to change. So these are some of the processes that we need to start invoking. How do you activate? There's an awful lot of blah out there about transitions. I mean, lots of great scientific publications and high impact factors and all that sort of good stuff. Doesn't seem to be an awful lot about, well, how do we actually wind the system up? So I was lucky enough to be part of the OECD team that did the innovation review of Finland about 1.5 2 years ago. And we thought we'd have a go. Can we at least sort of kick them off? So what we said was, why don't you, since, by the way, you've forgotten what research and innovation policy is and seem to have lost faith in that, I don't know why, get your mojo back. Yeah? Develop a national vision. Use the Research and Innovation Council. Yeah? Try and get whole of government commitment. And the great thing about the Finnish Research and Innovation Council is that it's got all the ministers who matter on it. So if you can get them engaged, then you've got a lot of the system. And be sensible, define and address the societal challenges that provide innovation and growth opportunities for Finland. So don't try and solve everybody's problem. Build on your record in foresight and governance. Historically, they've been very good at that. Make sure we get broad engagement across all parts of society. There have been periods where the Finns have told themselves we're all in the same boat. If you want a long discussion about Finnish history, we can do that afterwards over coffee. But it's something that the Finnish society understands. Yeah? So we need a wide-ranging process, foresighting, road mapping, analysis. Where can we go? Try and get some commitment to that, and then link in that way the societal challenges to business opportunities. To my astonishment, they're trying to do it. So what does that mean when you go out and do it? Well, you change the way you do policy. You go from reactive to proactive. You stop retrenching. You support research and innovation-driven growth. You get systemic. You try and get rid of the silos. You move the shift the focus towards society, and you try and move towards more radical innovation. All very easy things to say. Yeah. What you don't need to do is ignore the existing assets and the comparative advantages you've got in favour of green fields. It's a bit like those three governance generations. Just because we care about transitions doesn't mean we're allowed to stop caring about how innovation systems work, or indeed how basic science functions. Yeah? We need these levels. Yeah? That sells terribly badly in political circles. If everybody wants to say, "I've thrown away the old, I've found the new." Yeah? Well, it's absolute twaddle. Right? So, it's complicated. Live with it. One of the things they again have started doing is use public-private partnerships to try and implement, at least in some areas. Right? If you fund these things, you need a competitive process, not top-down. For historians of Finnish radical mistakes in research and innovation policy, what you do not do is choose 4 or 5 areas, put great big shock centres in them, top-down, and tell them they've got responsibility for stuff. You do what, I'm sorry, Sweden did for the equivalent competence centres. You have a competition. You see who puts their hands up. You see who's actually got the oomph and the linkages to the industrial side to actually do something. Yeah? As you can see, we pointed to more recent Swedish policy. we said, and I think this is a really important one, you have to be very careful when you use public-private partnerships, because you're delegating some of the power and money of the state to a collection of beneficiaries. So you really have to control them. This is a principal-agent problem, and it immediately becomes not in their interest to work for society's good, but to work in their own interests. Yeah? And you've got to harness that greed rather than let them rush off with the money. Right, so evaluation. The evaluation literature is full of twaddle. We have lots of schools. Most of us who think we're grown-up evaluators, who work with real programs and real governments, would describe ourselves as realist evaluators. You know, we don't do goal-less evaluation. We don't just ask everybody what they think. You know, we actually try and have a plan. And we accept what looks like a fact probably is a fact. So we're interested in what works for whom and in what circumstances. We try and be very careful about how things work. If I recommend anything to read this book. Yeah? It's, as it says, it's the only funny book in the evaluation literature. Most of the literature is so boring. Or it's people showing off, doing piddly little incremental innovations, sub-methods, you know. This one tells it like it is, and it's a sort of... And they've got this lovely joke formula, mechanism plus context equals outcome. And we do tend to forget that. We focus on the mechanism, we draw our logic diagrams, and we forget society. Yeah? We forget the people working against us. Right? And we can't do that. All right? So realist evaluation is about doing stuff, about thinking about what are the mechanisms, you know, that links the inputs to the outputs. What's happening in the mainstream evaluation literature around these kinds of big programs, complexity, all that sort of stuff? Well, again, I've had a wonderful excuse to update myself, because I shouldn't confess it in public, but I don't read all the literature all the time. Okay? So going back through the last decade or so of the mainstream evaluation literature, the first thing that strikes is this endless, silly little incremental innovation with people trying to flog different tools. Okay, fine, go to sleep. What we do see that's interesting is we're getting an interest in systems and complexity. They're not talking about transitions. They're talking about social situations, you know, by and large. Key book, Patton's developmental evaluation. But lots of authors are talking about it. And again, it feels like one of those moments where complexities become fascinating and fashionable and interesting, and there's a deafening silence when it comes to what's actually happening. All right. We're seeing an interest in increased stakeholder involvement, particularly in complex situations. That's coupled to more interest in participative evaluation to generate legitimacy, and that's one of the issues, if you remember, that we need to deal with in connection with transitions and bigger complex interventions. We have to get into multi-level governance if we're going to deal with these bigger things. So we have to worry about how do we connect the evaluation business and the evaluation process to the generation and implementation of policy, and does that work in the same way as before? Yeah? So governance, again from this direction, also seems to be becoming more important. What's actually going on in terms of tools for evaluating impacts? Yes, I've got my eye on the clock too, Enrico. I did a scamper for the OECD a couple of years ago through what kind of impact assessment or evaluation techniques are being used for research on innovation. It's that thick. I'm not going to tell you everything in the book. But there are sort of, the red bits are the kind of growing, interesting sort of stuff. There's a lot of really creative stuff going on here, trying to deal with I was going to say control groups, but lack of control groups, the inability to have controls. Lots of really innovative stuff. We're getting massive interest in randomized controlled trials. In many cases, under the complete misunderstanding that people imagine that these things are evaluation techniques, they're experiments. You know? So you test things out using these. It's very difficult to use an RCT to do ex post evaluation. But I mean, there's a lot of creativity and excitement there. So I don't want to disrespect the technology. After all, it's how we do medical research. But I want to keep it in the box where it belongs. Scientometrics has become very cheap compared with what it used to be, which means there's lots and lots of innovation, lots of not just citation analysis for the sake of quality understanding, but mapping communities, seeing networks, how the structures work. Really interesting stuff happening there. And because it's cheap, lots of amateurs using scientometrics in stupid ways and getting excited by journal impact factors as indicators of the quality of a particular article, which we know is nonsense, etc., etc. We've got really interesting, exciting stuff happening around altmetrics, and we don't know what any of it means. Yeah? And I'm a bit embarrassed when major customers for evaluations, I'll mention no names, but you can imagine a large organization in Brussels, specify the use of altmetrics in a serious evaluation. You know, I will take altmetrics. No, I take it seriously. It's interesting. It's showing something. The problem is we don't know what it is. And I will not use it in anger until somebody can tell me how to define a field normalized tweet. Right? We just don't know what this stuff is. Social network analysis gets prettier and prettier and prettier, and we still don't have any theories about what social networks really mean. Okay? And we've got increasing interest in evaluation or impact assessment techniques which are intended to change the behavior of the system that's being measured. Not describe it, but to change it. So performance-based research funding systems are intended to do exactly that. Now, in most of our world, we use theory-based evaluation, which basically means we tell a story to the finance ministry or the industry minister or whatever we like, that says there's a problem in society. Dear minister, please give us budget. We need some inputs, you know. Budget for Göran Pinova, right? Put some programs together, recruit some project leaders, make some outputs, yeah? And we can pretty much specify what those are, you know, when we write the contract. Because we've got those outputs, we expect useful things to happen. So we support innovation in a bunch of companies. Those companies start making new products and growing. And so far, it's a lovely story about income redistribution. So we've taken money from the taxpayer and made some companies richer. That's a good thing to do, isn't it? Yeah. Why do we do it? Because we expect to get growth and quality of life and all that sort of stuff down here. This is where the taxpayer gets the bang for her buck. You know, if we don't get this, the whole of that is just a rip-off. Right? But that's the story we tell. And we, of course, articulate this. Don't look at what's in the boxes. All this is supposed to say is, you know, we actually articulate this in detail. We predict. This is a program theory or an intervention logic. It says we expect these things to happen. Yeah? And the traditional thing we do as evaluators is, okay, let's follow the logic. Let's see if we can find indicators, find changes we can describe that either support or don't support that theory. Yeah? If we're really clever, we remember to look outside the program to see what's going on. Okay? But as soon as we get into complexity, emergent properties, we're a bit screwed, because this theory won't hold. It'll change through time. Yeah? So we've got to find ways of dealing with that. I'm going to skip these. Now, at the moment, we work with what I like to call a waterfall principle. But we tend to do things so that, ministries and governments evaluate organizations or get organizations evaluated. Agencies evaluate programs. Program managers evaluate projects. Nobody evaluates the politicians. But hey, maybe we wouldn't want to. Or maybe that's what elections are for. Okay? I suspect that for big things, cross-cutting things, we need to go beyond that kind of hierarchy. We can get more clever with theory-based evaluation. I'm sorry, this is absolutely tiny. But this is from a handbook on how to integrate traditional research and innovation impact assessment with environmental impact assessment. And all it does is basically to say, here's our inputs, here's our outputs, here are socioeconomic impacts, these are the environmental pressures, and here's what happens when you add those things to those things. Yeah? So we can get fancier like that, but we're still not dealing with change. One of the things we can think about, and this is from some work we did for the Chilean National Council for Innovation for Competitiveness, curious name, is basically to start getting hierarchical and deciding, well, we can actually set up an evaluation framework, strategy if you like, which works at, in their case, 3 levels. At the level of the innovation strategy, the national level, at the level of organizations who implement it, at the level of individual programs. Yeah? And here's our inputs, our activities, outputs, impacts, etc. Yeah? And you can run that through to the evaluation issues. Yeah. So we can put these kind of frameworks around multi-agency, more complicated interventions like an industrial strategy. That in turn requires that we have to agree to do it, that it's feasible and sensible to do it, and that we will work together. Okay, 2 minutes, Enrico, I'm going to make it. 4. Okay, so of course, I go to the literature, and what's the answer? Please tell me how to evaluate these. No, it isn't there, basically. There's one quite amusing paper which, at least amongst the things I've found so far, which has got some interesting ideas. It talks about reflexive monitoring, which does what it says on the packet. It monitors and it thinks about things, but it doesn't really evaluate. Talks about focusing on learning and interactions rather than predefined impact, so that we begin to cope with the idea of the intervention logic is a dynamic thing, yeah? Which in turn brings all sorts of questions about, well, how do you stay with it? How do you kind of approve it? When you evaluate it, is a change in the logic good or bad? Yeah, those kind of questions pop up. The authors talk about contribution analysis, which is a wonderful trick, in evaluation, we've got the attribution problem as one of our central issues. How do I know that this intervention causes that effect? Well, realist evaluators say, well, I can follow the logic. Okay, so I can show you the steps that go from there to there. And then you get all sorts of complications like Lennart Eil and Staffan Håkansson did this wonderful little summary of the long-term impact studies that Vinnova's been running over quite some years. And one of the consistent findings in those, they say, is that research funding turns out to have been necessary but not sufficient to get somewhere. So other factors are also important. So attribution, well then, okay. Well, if this thing is necessary but not sufficient, how much of the blame do I give it? And traditionally we make up some numbers, then we say we have to be conservative and we divide by the page number. But philosophically, actually, there's a real problem there. How do you attribute? What Maine says is let's just walk around that. Let's work out, can we show that our intervention contributes to change? So we're not going to claim that we cause all of it, but we are going to claim that we caused some of it, an unknown quantity. Which sounds like a really cool idea because it gets you out of certain difficult arguments. And then when you go through the method that Maine suggests it is so labour intensive. It seems to work in a few medical studies, but the rest of the world has kind of looked at it and gone, "No, I don't have the budget for that." So what kind of approaches do they suggest? Process, flexibility and adaptiveness, getting closer to real-time evaluation. These are long-term things. You have to live with them. My first education in evaluation was in a real-time evaluation of the ALVI program, the British IT4 or Esprit. I got bored after a couple of years and went and did something else. But the guys who stayed with this thing for 6 years, very good friends of mine, so I won't tell you their names, not in public. But you know, when I saw the final report, I thought, you've been captured. You've just totally been captured. You know, not being critical at all anymore. You know, and that's a real risk with real-time evaluation. Redefining the role of the evaluator, needing to get our hands dirty, and finding ways to be more learning-focused in our evaluations. So what do we need to do? So again, there isn't a magic answer, but I think these are some of the elements. We're going to need long-term evaluation strategies with governance that's linked to the interventions. Yeah? So we've got to have some trick that binds the evaluation governance to the intervention governance without capturing the evaluators.
What does that mean in practice?
Without capturing the evaluators?
No. Long-term evaluation strategies with governance linked to intervention. What does it mean in practice?
I mean, okay. So first thing, you need, if you're going to deal with these big problems, you're going to need fairly long-term strategies, which will be complicated things. They will have their own governance. If they're dealing with complexity, they will have to deal with changes in strategy as the thing goes through. Yeah? Now, that governance then also needs to be connected to evaluation, so we keep the evaluators on the question. Yeah? And I think our problem, in a sense, is then keeping the evaluation function sufficiently detached, that it doesn't become captured. Yeah? So we need frameworks spanning multiple sub-interventions, organizations and levels. And the thing I showed you from Chile is maybe a very, very crude prototype of the way we could think about doing that. We're going to have to do much more prospective as well as retrospective analysis. Because if it's about changing course, then we need to think that through as well. We need to quality assure the road mapping. Are we doing sensible things? Those kinds of issues pop up. And you can see, when we think in these terms, the boundary between evaluation and programming starts getting a bit fuzzy. And again, one's going to have to be careful about not making it so fuzzy that we just join in a single gang. Certainly multiple methods, triangulation, more participative, more learning evaluation, the capture issue. And there's a particular issue around public-private partnerships, which are always, at least in my experience, evaluation averse, because they're dominated by beneficiaries who don't want to be questioned, and because the beneficiaries dominate the budget, they also don't want to waste any money on evaluation. So a really, really tough hand with those guys. We've got to the end.